You've had the feeling before. Not a hunch. Something more specific. A knowing that arrived already formed, before you had any reason for it. You recognized something you'd never encountered. You felt something with the full weight of experience you haven't had. Most people dismiss this when it happens. They file it under coincidence, or call it anxiety dressed up in different clothes, or decide they must have picked it up somewhere and just don't remember where. Jung had a different explanation, and I think it's worth taking seriously. Not as metaphysics, but as a precise psychological claim about the architecture of the mind. Because what he described wasn't supernatural. It was structural. The first sign is this. You know things before you should know them. Not predictions, not psychic impressions. Something quieter. You meet a person, and something in you makes an assessment before your reasoning catches up. You avoid something, a situation, a dynamic, a type of relationship, and only years later do you understand what you were avoiding. You feel an emotional response to something that, by any reasonable accounting of your personal history, shouldn't carry that weight. Jung's framework for this is precise, and it's often lost in how people talk about him. In Volume 9 of the Collected Works, Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he distinguished carefully between the personal unconscious and a deeper layer he called the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious holds what you've repressed, forgotten, or incompletely processed. Your specific history. That layer is yours. Below it is something he described as not a personal acquisition, but inborn. The collective unconscious doesn't store your memories. It stores the patterns through which your species has encountered the world across the entire span of human existence. Not experiences themselves, potentials. Preformed responses to recurring human situations that have been refined across hundreds of generations of people who survived them. Jung wrote that this deeper layer contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. Born anew, not learned, not transmitted through stories or culture, structural. So when you recognize something you haven't personally encountered, you may be accessing a pattern that has been verified across generations of people who faced it before you. What looks like premature knowing is often something more ancient. A recognition that predates your biography entirely. The word intuition doesn't quite cover what this is. Intuition suggests something vague, impressionistic. What Jung was describing is more like a library, one you didn't choose to inherit, that doesn't announce itself clearly, but that answers before you finished asking the question. The second sign is less about what you know and more about where you feel you belong. If you've always felt older than your years, more at home with people who have lived longer, more drawn to things that already carry weight and time, more comfortable sitting with depth than chasing what's new, Jung would recognize this not as personality quirk, but as a particular kind of archetypal configuration. He wrote about what he called the senex, the principle of age, of accumulated depth, of wisdom that has stopped being impressed by novelty. It's one of the oldest archetypes in the collective psyche, the one who has been here before, who carries knowing quietly, who finds the urgency of the present moment slightly beside the point because they have felt it from too many angles. Some people are born carrying this weight, not as preference, as the deep structure of how they engage with the world. Here's where modern science starts to catch up to Jung in ways I find genuinely surprising. In 2025, a study published in Nature's Scientific Reports followed third and fourth generation Holocaust survivors, 371 participants. They found measurable epigenetic variation, actual biological differences in how stress-related genes were expressed, that persisted across 3 generations of people who had no direct experience of the original trauma. The changes were in the oxytocin system, the HPA stress axis, the nervous system's fundamental orientation toward the world. The children of survivors don't inherit memory. They inherit the physiological shape of the response to the world those memories created. Jung never had access to this research, but what he was pointing at, a layer of the psyche that holds not personal experience but its structural residue, refined and transmitted across generations, has now found a biological anchor he didn't predict and wouldn't have needed. Some people arrive with nervous systems already calibrated for a world they haven't yet lived. They find contemporary culture oddly thin. They feel themselves more the grandchild of a century than a native of the present one. They belong to time in a way that doesn't match their age. That's not alienation. Jung would call it a particular kind of access. The third sign is the quietest and the hardest to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. Your grief is larger than this life. I don't mean the grief that comes from losses you've experienced directly. I mean the other kind. The mourning of things you never had. A longing for places you've never been. The feeling of homesickness with no specific location attached. Losses that feel ancestral even when they're personal. As if the grief you're carrying arrived already in progress, and you walked into the middle of it somewhere along the way. I've been through enough of my own grief, and sat with enough other people in theirs, to know that this particular kind doesn't respond well to the usual timelines. It doesn't follow the logic of a specific event. You process the event, and the feeling remains. Slightly untouched, slightly independent of any cause you can point to. I read Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections twice in the years after my divorce. Once in a kind of desperate search for structure. The second time more slowly, when I had stopped needing it to give me answers. There's a passage where he writes about standing at the end of a long ancestral line, of sensing himself as a point through which something much older was passing forward. He didn't experience this as burden exactly, more as a recognition of scale, that his life was not only his life. He distinguished between personal grief and what he called primordial loss, the feeling that belongs not to this ego, but to what he called the self in its broader, suprapersonal dimension. In Volume 8 of the collected works, he wrote about affective states that simply exceed the individual. They belong to a layer of the psyche that is not personal, and to access that layer is to feel, occasionally and without warning, the cumulative weight of what the species has carried. The person who cries watching something they have no personal stake in, who feels grief for a world that preceded them, who feels in quiet moments the presence of people they never met and can't explain why. Jung did not pathologize this. He considered it evidence of depth, a measure of how far into the collective the individual psyche had managed to reach. I want to be honest about what I'm not saying here. I'm not telling you these signs make you special in the way that word usually gets used. I'm not offering a certification of spiritual advancement or a ranking system. And I'm not suggesting you have literal memories from another time. What Jung was pointing at is something more structural and in some ways more interesting. The psyche is not a closed system. It is not bounded by the individual life in which it appears. The architecture of who you are was built across a span of time that vastly exceeds your biography, inherited through mechanisms that are still being mapped, organized around patterns, refined across generations you can't name. Some people have more access to that depth than others, not because they've earned it, because something in the structure of their inner life reaches further down than average. The knowing that arrives uninvited. The gravity toward what has already lived. The grief that belongs, at least in part, to something larger than this particular story. I don't know what to do with that, honestly. I've been sitting with it for years. Reading Jung doesn't resolve it. It just gives you better language for it, and sometimes that's what you need most. Not answers. A frame wide enough to hold what you're actually carrying. Whatever wisdom you came in with, it's been a very long time in the making. Let that mean something to you.